Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Kohler and welcome back to class. Today we are going to be discussing directional terms. So we're going to be referring back to some of the medical terms that we have already discussed. So we're going to want to think about some of those prefixes, the root words, and the suffixes. So if we think back to those terms that we learned, what does a word ending in AL usually mean? What does that AL mean in a word? Pertaining to, good job, good job. So we want to remember that, okay? So it will be AL means pertaining to, and then we will discuss these directional terms and add to our medical terminology. So we're going to be talking about terms. We're going to be talking about planes. So you all know that we move in various ways throughout the day and that athletic sports include many movements, front and back, and we go side to side, and there's twisting involved. And those all happen in planes, and some movements happen more often than other movements. And we're going to talk about how that can affect injuries, how we need to be conscious of how we are moving throughout the day to protect our bodies. We're also going to be talking about movement terms related to how our joints move. So this will be fun because you guys get to get up and move around. It's not going to be just sitting for the whole time, but you get to perform these movements, and hopefully this will help you remember them a little bit better. After we get done with the directional terms for our joints, we're going to jump into body cavities and quadrants. So we know that the human body has many systems that help make everything work, but we're going to look at how those systems are organized a little bit more in detail and why are they organized this way. So for today, I need you guys to get out your notebooks. I need you to get pen or pencil, whatever you want to write with. We are going to start off with lecture first, so go get whatever you need, and then we'll get started. After lecture, you guys can expect to work on your video together in groups, and then we will be working on a worksheet on body cavities and quadrants so that you get a little bit more practice on your own. Any questions? No? Okay. So I'll pull up the lecture here while you guys are still getting situated, and off we go. Okay. So, sorry. We'll go from the beginning this time. There we go. So, for today, like I mentioned, we're going to be able to demonstrate planes and directional movement through the production of a video. And this video is not just going to be any video, but it's going to be a dance video. So you guys you're going to call out what movement you're doing while you're performing it. You get to have music playing in the background, appropriate music, and we'll talk more about that after lecture. We're also going to be able to compare quadrants and cavities of the human body, and we have Riptide and Marley here to help us on our learning journey. Yay! So anatomical directions is first. Before we get started, I want to know what you think. So why do you think it's important to communicate detailed terms in healthcare? Why would up or down not be sufficient? So for this little review, you guys can go on your laptops to pollev.com/jkohlerphs, or you can text jkohlerphs to this number, okay? So you'll type in this number, this will be your response, then you're into this and you can respond with whatever you think. There's no right or wrong answer here. I just want to know what you guys think, okay? So give you a minute or two to think about this. We always talk about why detail is so important, but in healthcare, we know that's especially important. So I'll fast forward here a little bit. And up or down could be very confusing because depending on how the body is oriented, it might mean different things, right? So if someone is standing up or laying down, you can't say up or down. So remember we talked about anatomical position a while ago. We're gonna do a little bit of a review on this, okay? So you're standing and everyone can stand up, standing, and your feet are going to be hip width apart and toes pointing forward. You are facing forward, shoulders are square, standing nice and straight up. Arms are down by your side, thumbs are pointing out, and pinkies are toward your legs. Okay, so this is anatomical position. So if I say, assume anatomical position, you know, stand up straight, head forward, toes forward, thumbs out to the side, okay? This is how everyone in healthcare and in anatomy thinks about the human body when they're talking about directional movements. So that's the unifying point, is everything's in anatomical position. So this was the best picture that I could find, but it's not very accurate. Can anyone tell me why? Good job. The arms are out straight like this, and we want the arms to be down by the side with thumbs out. So not proper anatomical position here, but it does show some other really good things. So superior, inferior, lateral, and medial are 4 direction terms that we want to start out with. These really mean up, down, away, and towards, okay? So superior is up, inferior is down, lateral is out, and medial is in. We need to talk about this a little bit more because it will help you get a better understanding, okay? So superior, we hold those things which are superior up higher, so we can remember that. Also, Lake Superior is up, so we can remember superior is up. Inferior would be something inferior to superior is lower, or it's not held in as high of regard, so it's inferior, so we can remember that is down. Inferior, down. Superior, up. And then lateral and medial can get a little tricky. So we are going to look at this red line right here down the midline of the body. And this is going to help us with medial and lateral. So lateral is moving away or out from this midline, okay? So see how this arrow is going away from this midline? Can you think of any movements that you do that would be considered a lateral movement? A lateral lunge. Yes, so you've heard this word before. Maybe you just didn't know what exactly it meant. But moving out to the side, away from the midline of the body. Good. So medial would be towards the midline of the body. So see this arrow? It's going towards the midline of the body. Also, remember that AL that we talked about? What 2 words have AL at the end? Lateral and medial. Good. So these are both direction terms, and AL means pertaining to. Good. So we can remember that these directional terms end in AL, pertaining to, because it's pertaining to movement away from or towards the midline of the body. The last 2 I don't have on here, anterior and posterior, but we've mentioned those before. Anterior meaning front, good, and posterior meaning back. Awesome, guys, awesome. Okay, so a couple more terms here that we have are superficial and deep. So these are important because if you are taking an x-ray or you are performing surgery, you can't say like under or above because that will start to get confusing. So we say superficial or deep. So if we look at our skin picture here, these are the different layers of our skin that we have learned. And our epidermis, we know, is our outermost layer, right? It's the layer that we can see. So that would be considered superficial. So this outermost layer is superficial, meaning on top, superficial, easily accessed to, okay? So deep would be under or below what is superficial, and it's harder to get to. So superficial surgeries are much easier than a deep surgery. So deep here could be everything that is below that is superficial, which is the epidermis. Can also be this adipose tissue is the deepest layer, okay? So most superficial layers, epidermis, deepest layer is our adipose tissue, okay? Superficial, epidermis, deepest layer would be adipose tissue. Okay, good. So a little review here. In the terms that we talked about, what means under or below. And again, you guys can go to the website here, or you can text using this number. So you enter in this number, text this, then you're in, and you can respond with those answers, okay? Okay, good job. So usually this would show me the results on what the students think, and we can go back and review. It also gives them a chance to ask questions. But at this point, I'm gonna have everyone stand up and take a break from sitting, okay? So we're going to practice some of these directional movements, just the first ones that we have talked about. So I want everyone to show me, what does superficial mean? Hands up, good, superficial. And what does inferior mean? Using your hands, show me inferior. Hands down at your feet, good, that is inferior. So we have superficial and we have deep, good. Okay, so let's do a little review from before. Show me anterior. Can you move your body in an anterior way? Anterior, good. And can you show me posterior? Posterior, very good, backwards. So anterior front, posterior is back. And can you show me remember this is our midline of the body here. Can you show me, what does lateral mean? What does lateral mean? You can use your foot or your hand. Away from the midline, good, away from the midline. And if lateral means away from and medial means towards the midline, what would it look like? In towards the midline, medial, midline, lateral, away, okay? So medial, midline, you can remember that. And then for our skin, what layer is the most superficial layer of our skin? Epidermis, good. And what is the deepest layer of our skin? Adipose. Excellent job, guys. Now we are going to talk about planes, okay? So you can have a seat again. We are going to get back into our notes. You will get another little break to move around in a couple minutes. So this picture is a good picture, but it's not my favorite. I just couldn't find a better picture. And I'm going to tell you why. So for this sagittal plane, you will see there are more terms over on this side than there are labeled here, and we're going to talk about that. So the sagittal plane, how would you describe that sagittal plane? It cuts the midline of the body. Good. So that's not going to be our definition of sagittal plane. So what we're going to say instead is that this is the median plane. Median. And this word is very similar to what word did we just learn? Medial. Yes, so how are we going to make that separation? How are we going to remember these two terms and not get them confused? Well, what does the directional term end in? AL. Yes, so it's pertaining to movement. Good. So if you can remember that medial is pertaining to movement and median is a plane, median plane, it will be a little easier, okay? So median plane, and now we want to know what is sagittal if that's not sagittal, right? So sagittal can move right and left. Median is our midline of the body, so that does not move, it stays put. It follows your spine all the way down and it does not move. Median does not move. Okay, sagittal, uneven right and left. And this plane can move around, okay? So if you're an X-ray tech, you will get very familiar with sagittal as it's taking a picture of different sides of the body and it moves around. So moves. What would the sagittal plane look like? Well, it can go anywhere, but it's still going to be a line. Just pretend that this is straight up and down. Okay, so that would be the sagittal plane. Okay, so then we have the frontal plane. And these terms have changed a little bit and they can be switched around. But for our class, we are not going to worry about coronal, which also is frontal. We're only going to call this a frontal plane, okay? So what do you notice about this frontal plane? How would you describe where it is in the body? What two terms does it help to separate? Anterior and posterior, good. So it's separating, we look at the slide, we see it here too, but it's separating anterior and posterior sides of the body, so front and back. Now, because coronal is also called frontal, there's also another name for transverse, and it's axial. So when you hear axial, or if someone says axial on your rotation, just know it means transverse. But for this class, we're always going to refer to it as the transverse plane. And this transverse plane is kind of interesting. It cuts the body at a 90-degree angle. So you're getting this green plane is our transverse plane, and it cuts horizontally. It is the only plane that cuts horizontally, okay? So we can remember transverse, horizontal, and all the rest of them are vertical. So if I were to give you an image like this on a quiz or a test, I would hope that you at least get one right and know that it's transverse is the horizontal plane, okay? I know you guys will get all of them right, but you got a fair shot getting at least one. So let's talk about these movements, okay? Or these planes, and why is it important? What movements happen in these planes? A lot of different movements. And if you are going into physical therapy, or if you are going into physical therapy aid, you need to know this stuff, or in athletic training too. It's really important because you're dealing with movement, you're dealing with athletes or people who are moving and you're trying to get them back into an active lifestyle. So you will refer to these planes often. Sagittal. How do we describe our sagittal plane? Cuts the body in uneven right and left. Good. So that includes forward and back movement. So if we look back to this plane, you can see that sagittal plane would follow along with the median plane, but it just moves. That's the only difference. And you're moving, so it's the sagittal plane going front and back. So these movements follow the planes. Now frontal is the blue plane, and that includes cartwheels or lateral movement. So we look here and we see that blue plane or purple, whatever you want to call it, and that's going to be that side to side movement. So you can see how doing a cartwheel would be in the frontal plane. It also includes lateral lunges, so anything moving in those directions. Axial and transverse rotation, because it is a horizontal line, anything with a twisting movement is going to be happening in that transverse plane. So more of our athletic movements are quick, fast, turning directions, changing movements. Those happen in transverse plane. So what plane do you think we most often move in? Sagittal. Good. There's a lot of walking in the day. We're not doing quite so many cartwheels as walking. So sagittal is a plane we most often move in. What plane do you think we least often move in? This can be a little tricky. It's the transverse or rotational plane. So not too often, unless we are athletes, are we doing a lot of twisting and moving. So what might that tell us about those type of movements? Maybe they're more difficult. It can also be that we're weaker in those type of movements because they're more difficult and we're not doing them as often. So it's important to keep those rotational movements in with your activities of daily living so that you maintain a strong all-around body, because most injuries happen in that transverse plane. Like when you plant your foot and you twist to make a direction, what kind of mechanism of injury does that usually lead to? A knee injury, right? A knee injury. So that's how most ACL tears can happen. Is from that planting and movement, or an ACL in your meniscus, and the other ligaments of your knee can also be damaged from that type of twisting movement. So this is why strength conditioning is important when you're an athlete, because you can isolate and practice those movements in a controlled manner before you get out onto the field and it's not so controlled, right? You can't control the other players, you can't control the conditions of the field. So by working on your balance, your rotation with a controlled movement, you can become a lot stronger, which is pretty cool. So everyone, let's get up and we are going to practice moving in these planes, okay? So first, and for this one, let's not do too many cartwheels, okay? And it's gonna give it away, but we're gonna do frontal plane, okay? So I wanna see a frontal plane movement. So yes, lateral lunges, good. What about sagittal plane? So remember, that's forward and backward type of movement. So yes, you can do lunges, forward and back, and most often walking or running. Very good. And then axial. What's a rotational type of movement? Good. Some ab work, right? We can do work on our abs with that rotational movement. Excellent. Good job. Okay, so a little review here. Again, you're going to go to polev.com/jkohlerphs, or you are going to text 37607 with the message jkohlerphs, and then you can type your response. how can you differentiate median and medial? So I'll give you a little break here to think about this before we move on. All right, so can anyone tell me, or usually would show their responses, but we're going to talk about median and medial, with AL being the pertaining to movement. Median ends with an N and it's plain. So hopefully that helps them make that connection a little bit more. All right, we are getting into movements here. So first, we're going to start with AB and adduction, okay? So we're gonna watch a little video and hopefully this will make some more sense, and we will talk about it and practice it too.
What is abduction and adduction? These are two words used to describe the movements of limbs. Abduction is movement of a limb or part of a limb away from the midline of the body. Adduction is movement of a limb or part of a limb toward the midline. When the arm is lifted away from the side and upwards toward a horizontal position, that is abduction. When it is brought down again to hang by the side, that movement is adduction. If you move your little toe outward, you are abducting it. When you move it back in to lie alongside the other toes, you are adducting it. The practical importance of these terms is that they enable physicians to describe the actions of particular muscles with precision. Some body muscles are referred to as abductors, while others are termed adductors.
Okay, so what type of movement have we already talked about that this sounded pretty similar to? If we go back to that picture, I'm just going to pause it so you can see the picture. But we are doing abduction, and I like to say AB because when you're just saying abduction and adduction, it sounds quite similar, right? So while we're learning this, I think it's helpful to say abduction and adduction. So abduction is away from the body. What else was away from the body or away from the midline of the body? Lateral movement. Yes, so you can see how in this picture, the arms are being moved away from the midline of the body in abduction. And we'll see this happen not just at the arms, but the legs too, when we start to get more into the muscles. So if we have performed abduction, how do we return back to anatomical position? We need to perform adduction. And I really like adduction because it is adding to the midline of the body, okay? So abduction is taking away from the midline. Adduction, you're adding to the midline of the body. So we're gonna practice that. Just sitting in your seat, I want you guys to not hit the person next to you, but practice. On the count of 3, we're gonna do abduction, okay? So 1, 2, 3, abduction. And to get back to anatomical position, we have to do adduction, adduction. One more time, abduction and adduction. Nice job, nice job. Our next slide here is going to be on the ankle. So we just looked at the shoulder, and there are many more movements that happen at the shoulder. We're just not going to talk about all of them yet, okay? So this is going to be an ankle picture that is going to include many movements all at once. It's a multi-movement joint, okay? So is the shoulder. We're just not getting that far into detail.
In the anatomical lower extremity, there exist three cardinal planes: sagittal, frontal, and transverse. Anatomical motion that occur parallel to these planes are considered to be the dominant motions of that plane. The horizontal or transverse plane divides the foot in a superior and inferior half. Adduction and abduction are the motions that occur. Parallel to this plane, adduction is when the foot and leg are medially rotated toward the midline of the body. Abduction is when the foot and leg are laterally rotated away from the midline. The frontal or coronal plane divides the foot into anterior and posterior portions. Inversion and eversion are the motions that occur parallel in this plane. Inversion is when the plantar surface of the foot rotates toward the midline of the body, and eversion is when the plantar surface of the foot rotates away from the midline of the body. The sagittal plane, which in the foot is approximated to the osteological axis of the second metatarsal, separates the foot into medial and lateral halves. Parallel to this plane, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion refer to the relationship between the surface of the foot and the anterior surface of the leg. Thus, dorsiflexion is when the dorsum of the foot moves toward the leg, whereas plantar flexion is defined when the dorsal surface of the foot moves away from the leg. It should be noted that the process of walking happens in the sagittal plane. Triplanar motion does not occur in parallel to any of the three cardinal body planes mentioned. It is merely one motion consisting of components from all three body planes. This can be demonstrated in the lower extremity by actions of pronation and supination, which are triplanar motions. Pronation is a motion of the foot which is comprised of eversion, dorsiflexion, and abduction. With this, the foot is seen to move toward the anterior leg, while the toes and plantar surface move away from the midline. Whereas supination consists of inversion, plantar flexion, and adduction, resulting in the foot to move away from the anterior leg, with the toes and plantar surface moving toward the midline. At a particular joint, in order for a given triplanar motion to be in supination or pronation, it must consist of motions discussed above. The amount of each movement depends on the anatomy of the joint. With that said, it is critical to understand that pronation and supination are triplanar motions, but not all triplanar motions are considered pronation or supination. In the anatomical
Okay, so that video goes pretty in detail and she talks pretty quickly, right? But some key points, and we're gonna watch this again, but some key points in that. How many people have heard pronation and supination? Many of you, right? You go in for a pair of shoes and they're like, oh, you're a pronator, you're an overpronator. It's okay to pronate, everyone pronates. So we are going to move around a little bit before we watch this again, because we've heard these terms, now we're going to practice these terms and see if maybe we can make a little bit better connection this time, okay? So our ankle doesn't just move in one plane like she talked about. There are three planes involved. There's a lot of movement at your ankle. You may have never thought about this walking, but it's pretty impressive what happens at your feet. And it all starts at your feet. Most injuries can happen due to someone having like bad feet, or it's where it starts in your foot and then it ends up going to your knee or your hip. And this is most like sports injuries, okay? So some of you may have had bad foot injuries, and you know it's really hard to recover from those because it's hard to stay off your feet. So first, let's talk about dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, okay? So let's just look at our foot. We're going to hold our leg out here and point your foot. That is plantar flexion. Pointing is plantar flexion. Point your toes. Dorsiflexion is where you bring your foot towards your face, okay? Bring your foot up towards your face. Foot up. So let's practice those first. So we're gonna stand up, and I want you guys to practice walking around in plantar flexion. So can you show me plantar flexion? Good, on your toes, good. And now dorsiflexion. how would we walk around in dorsiflexion? On our heels, yes. So foot up, heels, pointing toes. Next, we're going to talk about inversion and eversion, and I think this is best done when you are in standing. You can also sit if you need to take a little break, okay? But sitting or standing, feet forward as best you can. If you want to take off your shoes quickly, go ahead and do so, as it makes it a little bit easier to see and feel what's happening in your feet. So inversion oops. Okay, so sorry. Whoops. Okay, sorry. Okay, so inversion is where your foot moves in, and eversion is where it moves away, okay? So kind of like abduction, but this is a different type of movement. So thinking back to our pronation and supination, maybe terms that we've heard a little bit more, okay? So pronation is often thought of as what? Flat-footed. Yes, when they say you're overpronated, they say you have flat arches. So you need something to help hold that arch up, and they'll give you a nice set of inserts. The supination is where your arches are too high. So this is, I think, better thought of when you're talking about, like, if you hold your hand up, you can't really see on the video, hold your hand up, this is supination, palm up towards the ceiling like you're holding a bowl of soup, and then pronation is when you flip that bowl of soup over. So think about that in your feet. Just move your feet around a little bit, in and out. You can feel your ankles moving. Good. So now we're going to move with our toes too and go in and out, and that's going to be abduction and adduction. Can you tell me which one would be adduction? When we are adding to what? The midline of the body. Good. And abduction is moving away from the body. Abduction is away from the body, okay? So we're gonna watch this video again.
Lower extremity, there exist three cardinal planes: sagittal, frontal, and transverse. Anatomical motion that occur parallel to these planes are considered to be the dominant motions of that plane. The horizontal or transverse plane divides the foot in a superior and inferior half. Adduction and abduction are the motions that occur parallel to this plane.
So remember, adduction and abduction, adduction towards the midline, abduction away. So it's that the toes are moving in and out.
And adduction is when the foot and leg are medially rotated toward the midline of the body. Abduction is when the foot and leg are laterally rotated away from the midline. The frontal or coronal plane divides the foot into anterior and posterior portions. Inversion and eversion are the motions that occur parallel in this plane. Inversion is when the plantar surface of the foot rotates toward the midline of the body, and eversion is when the plantar surface of the foot rotates away from the midline of the body.
Okay, so the inversion and eversion is that rolling of your foot. So eversion is where your pinky toe moves up. Pinky toe up. And inversion is where big toe is down. So if we think about our ankles, and how many of you have ever sprained your ankle? See a few hands. Which way did your ankle go when you rolled it? Do you remember? Most people sprain their ankle when it's going with big toe down or big toe up. I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong. Big toe up, big toe up. And if you have your feet down on the ground and you try to roll your big toe up for inversion, big toe up, you have quite a bit of movement there, right? Now try to go the other way and pick up your pinky toe. You don't have much movement, right? So the inversion type of ankle sprain happens much more often. Eversion does not happen that often. And eversion can be bad because you can end up breaking the bone on the outside of your leg, which is your fibula. Good job, guys. So we talked about that. Adduction, toe goes into the midline, toe midline, toe away. And this kind of messes up the writing, so sorry about that. But and then when we add all of those movements together, we start to get the pronation and supination, right? So inversion and eversion is just that rolling. And then when we talk about pronation and supination, it's all three of them into one, okay? So you can write that down here. Pronation, supination. And these are multiplanar.
The sagittal plane, which in the foot is approximated to the osteological axis of the second metatarsal, separates the foot into medial and lateral halves. Parallel to this plane, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion refer to the relationship between the surface of the foot and the anterior surface of the leg. Thus, dorsiflexion is when the dorsum of the foot moves toward the leg, whereas plantar flexion is defined when the dorsal surface of the foot moves away from the leg. It should be noted that the process of walking happens in the sagittal plane. Triplanar motion does not occur in parallel to any of the three cardinal body planes mentioned. It is merely one motion consisting of components from all three body planes. This can be demonstrated in the lower extremity by actions of pronation and supination, which are triplanar motions. Pronation is a motion of the foot which is comprised of eversion, dorsiflexion, and abduction. With this, the foot.
So pronation is eversion. I just want to make sure I get this right. So we're going to go back a little bit here.
Eversion, dorsiflexion, and abduction.
Dorsiflexion and abduction.
With this, the foot is seen to move toward the anterior leg, while the toes and plantar surface move away from the midline. Whereas supination consists of inversion, plantar flexion, and adduction, resulting.
So supination would be the opposite, right? So we have inversion, plantar flexion, and adduction, okay? So this is a lot of movement that we're talking about. So I want you guys to stand up again, and we are going to practice this a little bit more, okay? So stand up, you can sit too if you want to, if you just would prefer to sit. So let's start with adduction and abduction. So toes go towards the midline for adduction, away for abduction. Good. Now, inversion is that rolling movement, okay? So inversion and eversion, we are rolling. And adduction and abduction is kind of like wipers. And then dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, we are pumping our ankles. So these are the three movements. We have the rolling, big toe up, little toe up. And then we have pumping, going up is dorsiflexion and down is plantar flexion, okay? So show me adduction. Good. Abduction. Good. Inversion. Big toes up. Good. Eversion. Little toes up. Good. Dorsiflexion, walking on your heels. Plantar flexion, on your toes. Very good. We're going to talk about this a lot more, okay? So if it seems a little confusing, hang in there. Our next slide, I showed you guys a little bit of a sneak preview. It's supination and pronation. So not only does this movement happen at our feet, but it also happens at our wrists. And if we think about it, our hands and feet are pretty similar in the way that they're made up, right? Our ankle bones and wrist bones are very small, irregular bones, and then we have long bones for our hands and our fingers. And those little small irregular bones are what allows for us to have a lot of movement going on.
Let's look at pronation versus supination, which is which. For this video, I suggest you act out the actions that you see. So if you put your
So you guys can follow along with this video, okay? So you'll just have your arm out, just like he says.
arm in the similar position as is shown here and rotate it around a few times. So you can see that your arm rotates around the forearm. And also if you straighten your arm, I don't have a picture of it, but if you straighten your arm, you can make the same rotations with your arm completely straight. So the words supination and pronation are the same no matter what angle your elbow is at. It's just a matter of which direction your forearm is rotating. When your palm is facing up, it has been supinated. The action of rotating it around is called supination. When you cup your hand and the palm is face up, it's like a little bowl of soup. So I just remember supination, bowl of soup. But when you spell it, remember to leave out the O. Once you know supination, it's easy to know pronation because it's just the opposite. So when your palm is face down, it has been pronated. The act of rotating your palm around in this direction is called pronation.
Okay, so we have supination, you're holding that soup, and then you drop that soup, and that is pronation, okay? That one's a little bit easier, and we don't have quite so many terms on this slide. So move on. Elevation and depression. You guys may have heard these words before, but it's really just shoulder shrugging and then pressing those shoulders. So we'll see it acting out here.
Okay, so we're talking about the differences between shoulder girdle elevation and shoulder girdle depression. This is an action that I see a lot in gymnastics done inappropriately. In this particular case, it was done from a descent, from a cast and support on the bars. When you begin to change from a support to a hanging position, you want to make sure that you maximize your length from your hands to your toes. You do that by completely relaxing the shoulder girdle. When you do that, your shoulder will go from a position here where the shoulder girdle is depressed to a position where the shoulder girdle is elevated. So this is shoulder girdle depression, where the scapula and the head of the humerus, the upper arm, are pulled downward. The clavicle is also involved in that. And this is shoulder girdle elevation, where the shoulder is lifted up above the shoulder. And you can do this by.
Okay, so we're gonna stop there. So the elevation is up, like an elevator takes you up, and then shoulder depression is down, which you can relate to if you're feeling depressed, you're feeling down, right? So elevate, like an elevator, goes up, depress, like you're depressed. So let's practice that, okay? So shoulders shrugs up by your ears, that is elevation, and then depression, pull those shoulders down and away from your ears. You can do a nice little neck stretch. Feels good after taking some notes and sitting for a while. Okay, we're gonna move on to the next slide. Protraction and retraction is a fun one. You'll get to see in this video. This is a quick one. Okay, we'll watch that a little bit more. We'll watch that again and I'll explain a little bit more, okay? So notice the jaw is moving and it is going out for protraction and then back in for retraction, okay? This movement happens in other parts of the body. We'll watch it again. So out, protracted, bring that jaw back in, that is retracted, okay? So you guys practice along too. Protract and retract. Retract, you're bringing it back. Retract. All right. We can do that in our shoulders too. If we protract our shoulders, we're separating them and making those shoulder blades go wide away from your spine. Now bring them back toward that midline, and that is retract, okay? So there's another example. Shoulders wide, and then bring them back, and that feels good too after sitting for a while. So protract those shoulders, retract those shoulders. Scaption and retraction. So this is similar to what I just went over with the protraction and retraction, but scaption, because our scapulas don't just move in one way, it's called scaption. So it's a multiplanar movement again, and you'll just see it here. We are not going to go over it much in detail. So that is just the adduction towards the midline, away, and then we have elevation, depression. Notice that that is moving in a multiplanar way, so that is scaption, okay? So that is including many movements there. And it's just interesting to see how that scapula moves around to allow for you to do overhead movements, right? So when you're throwing a ball or swimming or acting out a play in basketball and you're passing and shooting, these scapulas help to allow that movement to happen with your upper arms. So just an example of why learning the planes and learning the directions is helpful. We get to see that our body moves in many different ways. It's cool. And this is just an overview of the planes. And I will leave that up on our slides for you guys to go over, but let's look over it quickly. So you can come back to this anytime.
We're going to introduce you to the basic anatomy topic, planes and axes. Hi and welcome back to Physio Tutors. Planes and axes are used to describe all osteokinematic movements that can occur in a joint. Be aware that the anatomic position is always the starting position of every movement described.
And anatomical position is good, standing, facing forward, toes forward, arms at your side, and thumbs out. So I will leave this video up and post it so you guys can come back and take a look at it, but we're going to move on to a little review before we get into body cavities and quadrants, okay? So what plane do most of our activities occur in? What are most of our activities? Walking and running, good. And where does that occur? In the sagittal plane, nice job. Okay, so this is an example of the video project that you guys are gonna be doing. You're gonna be creating a dance, telling me the movements that you're performing. And this video is a little bit shorter than the 2 minutes, but because they came up with a rap, I gave them credit, okay? So you don't have to rap, you can just do the dance. And you can have music playing in the background and just say out loud what you are doing as you're performing.
The best joint pure flexion is the elbow. But don't forget the first step of initiating the heart. It's extension of the elbows.
Flexion of the elbow, extension of the elbow, abduction, put your arms up. I'm in freaking farmer. Abduction, put your arms up. Dare to stand my palm down.
Doing some flexing on my ankles, walking on your heels. Gus has cankles, thought you need to hear. I told him no, I don't water the plant. Bring my mom ass, I'm walking on my ankles and my heels to the dance. Day one, new job, working in the factory. Need to rotate your back to me.
Circumduction, middle of the shoulders. The moment I said, she tell me when I'm older.
Time to attract, move your shoulder blades black. My name is Zach, and I'm looking for the army, and that's a fact. Cool.
Okay, so that's just a little example. You guys can have fun with this, and it should be fun, okay? Okay, we're gonna go over quadrants and cavities. Quickly, and probably go over this again tomorrow, okay? So quadrants and cavities, why would it be important for parts of the bodies to be contained separately? Because if you have an infection, you don't want it to travel throughout the body. You want to try to keep it as best you can. So that's why we have our different cavities of the body. And quadrants is more an organizational way of, like if someone comes in with pain and they'll point to where it is, we know quadrants because quadrants are how the organs are organized. So we're going to learn what organs are in what quadrant. Whereas our cavities, and it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but we have our cavity, there's one cavity in yellow, and then the other cavity, main cavity, is in red, but that is separated into a couple different areas, okay? So if we're thinking of just directional terms, what do you think this yellow cavity would be called? Posterior close. What's another word for posterior that we learned? Like you have a fin, and that is your dorsal. Good, dorsal. And now the red would be called, what's the opposite of dorsal? Ventral, yes. And we're going to learn about those different cavities that are within that ventral cavity, okay? So these are quadrants, and they can be separated into 4 or they can be separated into 9. 9 gets a little bit more detail oriented. For cavities, We have, again, this is our dorsal back here, and then we have the ventral in the front, and we have our thoracic, which makes sense because that is our thorax. And then we have the abdominal pelvic, which makes sense because that covers our abdomen and pelvic area, okay? So we're gonna talk a little bit more about how these areas help to protect our body and how they all function together tomorrow. But we will get started after review on the video, okay? So how would you describe the difference between a quadrant and a cavity? Quadrant would be organization and cavity would be the separation, right? So review on what we talked about, and if you don't quite understand the quadrants and cavities, it's okay, we're coming back to it. What term means up? So I want you guys to log in and we are going to play a little competition game before we get started on the videos. What term means up? 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Superior. We're going to pretend like everyone got it right. Good job. And then it will show who is leading at this time. And this happens. So we're just going to exit and then come back. What plane are injuries most likely to occur in? There it is. Okay, so you have a little bit longer to respond to this one. We're having some technical difficulties here, but we're going to pretend like everyone got that one right too, and then it will show the leaderboard, and then we'll move on to cavities in the body help to do what? These are a couple of the options, and this one, 2 answers are correct. So this one, hopefully they have chosen protect the systems and prevent systemic infection. And this is the end of the competition, and it will show who won with confetti's flying. And then we have directions, plane, quadrants, and cavities. And this is a time for them to ask open-ended questions. And I can go over anything that they ask. It is anonymous, which is nice. And then I will put up the rubric. This is the rubric for the videos, and I will allow them to work on their project. Okay. And just in case you didn't get to see that rubric, this is the rubric. Okay, so usually my classes are 2 hours in length, so they would have the rest of the hour to work on their videos, and then we go over the worksheet, and this is the worksheet for them. So they just work on identifying, labeling, and be able to compare and contrast and draw. So that is it. Thank you for listening, and I hope to get some great feedback. And it was fun to learn about this stuff and how to do it. So thank you, and bye.